My name is Dr. Michelle Lam. I am a Canada Research Chair in Rural Community-Based Education for Reconciliation, and I'm sitting here in BU Cares. This is a research center in the Faculty of Education. We exist to facilitate and support research that benefits rural and Indigenous communities. Cares started in 2008. The idea was recognizing that teachers in rural and Indigenous communities are wanting some support for new initiatives they're doing or things that they are trying out in their classrooms. And so I think it started with a focus on teacher practice, supporting schools in rural and Indigenous places. We now have 5 theme areas that are sort of broad umbrellas. And so those are Indigenous education, eco-justice, student well-being and mental health, anti-racism and equity, and then educational technology or digital tech. I started out actually as a research assistant here. So I was teaching at Westman Immigrant Services, and I had very young children at the time. So I was home in the day and then teaching in the evenings. And my boss at the time was starting a research project to look at sort of predicting immigration trends in Brandon. So this was back in the days when Maple Leaf was new to Brandon, and they were seeing a huge influx of immigrants and then seeing that the needs were changing over time. So after 2 or 3 years, they were bringing families and things like that. So they wanted to be able to predict a little longer term instead of just sort of seeing what came through the door and what needs were there. So they started this research project and they invited me to be part of it. And at the time, I didn't know very much about research, but I really fell in love with it. I liked that it was fast-paced. I liked that it was community-oriented. I liked that it was really practical. The information we were gathering was immediately useful for the organization, and I loved that. And so I think that project really started my journey into research, and that was a project that was facilitated by CARES. So then I've come full circle since then. I just loved research so much. I started my PhD the year that that project ended. And then just as I was finishing my PhD, this position came up. So full circle for me. All of our projects are participatory or community-based or action-oriented, things like that. Different methodologies use different terminology, but in general, I think you get the idea that they're focused around community needs. And that makes sense because almost all education research is done with schools or done with community partners. So I think for an education center, having partnerships with community is where it's at. I think there's really a lot of good work that happened even before I was here and work that's happened that I wasn't directly involved with. One that's been really impactful for me has been an anti-racism film project. In that project, we surveyed 500 Manitobans, and in that survey asked them to share a time when they witnessed or experienced racism in the last 12 months. And then based on the common elements of those stories, we created scripts and then read the scripts with focus groups to refine them, and then hired filmmakers to create the films, and then launched them on social media, and then analyzed the comments in response as a sort of public response to anti-racism content. And I think that project was really creative and meaningful because it was local to Manitoba, and so the experiences were very real for people here. And then in sharing the films with people, we've created a facilitation guide and done a lot of work around how to use the films in schools or how to use them in a good way in professional development settings. But I think some of the feedback we get from the films are for people who experience racism. They've said things like, I feel like I'm watching my own life. And I think the reason they feel so real is because they were based in that research and in real people's experiences. And so I love that that is something that we've produced. I'm really proud of that. One of the things that people might not think of right off the bat is that I think the experiences that students have here as part of being part of research projects, I think that says a lot about a center or about the research that's happening. And so I have a few research assistants that have stuck with me now for 4 years, and I feel really honored that they're still continuing on, even though some have graduated, some have gone to PhD programs, but they're really invested in the work that we're doing. They believe in it and willing to stick around. And then there are other things like I send a survey to project partners when a project ends with them and those kinds of things too. And I think because we're in the field of education, there is collaboration possibilities everywhere. If you're a history prof, well, there are people in education that need to teach history. The anti-racism work that we do has a lot of crossover with something like sociology. So I think that education is unique in that way, that we have something to offer other disciplines, maybe pedagogically, but I think also other disciplines have things to offer us in terms of their deep dive into some content areas. And I think it can be really beautiful when people come together to work across disciplines. A lot of schools seem to really like action research, which makes sense, right? We want to see some improvement, and in classrooms, you try something out and then you see how it worked and then you adapt, and sort of those cycles, that's really well suited to action research. So that's a pretty common methodology for people who are actively in schools. We've done case studies, we've done a lot of qualitative work, some mixed methods. For me personally, I'm sort of bent towards arts-based methodologies, so that's where the film creation comes in. Really, I think the research question, or the things that you're trying to explore or you're curious about, that's what drives the methodology that you choose. And so it really depends on what people are trying to learn. One of the challenges I find, and I think this is pretty common for people working with communities, a lot of times in terms of our research ethics processes, we can't really start recruiting for a project until we've had approval from research ethics, which is for a good reason, right? You don't want to do anything until you've thought through how things are going to work ethically. But for community-based research, often it's coming out of existing partnerships or existing relationships. And so for things that are driven by the community, the questions and the research needs come from the community. And so that sort of recruitment area gets really murky, right? So that's one thing that I sometimes feel like I have to really carefully think through when I'm submitting an ethics proposal, for example. How is this relationship being defined, and making sure that no one feels pressured into doing research and there's shared ownership and things like that. I sometimes find that people come in with an idea like, oh, university researchers are intimidating. And I get that, because I used to feel like that. I remember when I started, a researcher that came to pitch the project to us. She was wonderful. She did a great job. But I think what made it so appealing was that she was just sort of a normal, down-to-earth person. And so that made it sort of accessible. But I think that that can help when you have that kind of idea that research is something that's really intimidating. I think for teachers, what I would say is that you're probably already doing research in your classroom, that sort of continual improvement process and reflecting on what you're doing and what's working and what you're trying. You're probably already doing it. It's just learning new terminology to put around it. The most direct way is by hiring research assistants who work here. Some other ways are things like we've had students kind of pop in, curious about this research, or things like, I think maybe I want to do a thesis, but I'm not sure. Can I just talk about some ideas? I love those conversations. So if you're a student listening to this, the door is open, come chat. And then there's also something called student service learning, which we've had a few students come through and do. And that's sort of a volunteer program where you spend 20 hours volunteering, and as a result, you get an annotation on your transcript that says you were involved in student service learning. And then the last way, I think, is through practicum. So we have sort of a practicum in community-based research in our faculty, and so we've had students come through, and instead of getting paid as a research assistant, they're getting course credit. I've gone into quite a few colleagues' classes to share those anti-racism films, and then to lead their class in a conversation about racism in schools and how educators can work towards anti-racism pedagogies or practices in their classroom. And so I hope that the research that we do is inspiring and helps people to think in new ways. I hope that BU Cares keeps going, that it is able to share the story of the good research that's happening. I hope that we keep listening to people who are in schools and community members. I hope that that never changes, that kind of close to the ground sort of approach. And I hope that more and more people come in who have new ideas and new experiences and take it in the direction that it needs to go.